Between they went looking for corroboration. Where something is documented, I will say it is documented. Where something is contested, I will say it is contested. A Bagnell has never issued a comprehensive, point-by-point rebuttal to the detailed research, and where he has responded, I will tell you what he said. Let's start with the story as the world received it. Frank William Bagnell Jr. was born in 1948 in Bronxville, New York. His father ran a stationery business. His mother was French-Canadian. In his telling, the defining moment of his childhood came at around age 16, when his parents divorced, and a judge asked him in open court which parent he wished to live with. He says he could not answer, ran out of the courtroom, and did not see his mother again for 7 years. What followed, by his account, was a career. It began small. He says he used a petrol credit card his father had given him to run a scam on service stations, buying tires and batteries, then persuading the attendant to give him cash for them at a discount, with the bill going to his father. Then came check fraud. He opened bank accounts, wrote checks against them, and worked out how to keep the process running. The problem, he says, was that a teenager cashing large checks attracts attention. He needed to look like someone who ought to have money and ought to be moving between cities. So, in his account, he became a pilot. He telephoned Pan American Airways claiming to be a pilot whose uniform had been lost by a hotel dry cleaner, and was directed to the company's supplier, where he collected a uniform and charged it to a fabricated employee number. He acquired identification. And then, he says, he began deadheading, the industry practice of airline crew traveling free in the jump seat on other carriers' flights when they need to reposition. Under the name Frank Williams, he says he flew over 1,000,000 miles, stayed in hotels billed to the airline, and cashed forged Pan Am payroll checks in city after city, because a uniformed airline captain presenting a company check is close to the least suspicious person a bank teller sees all week. Then, he says, he retired from flying because the risk was rising, moved to Georgia, told the landlord he was a doctor, and was drawn into standing in as a supervisor of resident interns at a hospital under the name Frank Connors. holding the post for 11 months by delegating every actual medical decision and using the phrase that a lay person will not question. Then Louisiana, where he says he claimed a Harvard law degree, sat the state bar examination, failed it twice, passed it on the third attempt through sheer memorization, and worked for the state attorney general's office for around 8 months. Then a period teaching sociology at Brigham Young University under the name Frank Adams. The end, in his telling, is as cinematic as the rest. He was recognized in France by an Air France flight attendant he had previously dated, arrested, and served time in an appalling French prison at Perpignan in conditions he describes as near medieval. Then Sweden. Then extradition to the United States, where he escaped from a taxiing aircraft at New York through the rear toilet hatch, was recaptured, and then escaped again from the federal detention center in Atlanta by convincing staff he was a prison inspector, aided by a friend posing as a magazine reporter. Recaptured in New York, he received a 12-year federal sentence, served around 5, and was released early on condition that he assists the federal government in detecting fraud. That is the account. It became the book Catch Me If You Can in 1980, written with the journalist Stan Reddy. It became the Spielberg film in 2002. It became a musical. And it became the foundation of a Bagnall and Associates, a security consultancy, and of a lecturing career in which he has said he delivered thousands of presentations to the FBI Academy and to corporations around the world. Before we test any of it, it is worth saying clearly that the story was plausible. Not obviously true, but genuinely possible, and that plausibility is a large part of why it traveled. The 1960s were, from a fraud perspective, a different world. There was no centralized digital identity infrastructure. There were no network databases that a bank teller could query, verifying that a person was who their identification said they were, meant telephoning an institution during office hours and hoping someone competent answered, and almost nobody did it for a routine transaction. Checks in particular were a system built almost entirely on trust. A check was a piece of printed paper instructing a bank to pay. Clearing took days. The physical document had to be transported, sorted, and processed by hand, which meant that the gap between a check being cashed and anyone discovering it was worthless could run to a week or more. In that gap, a person could be several cities away. Check printing itself required equipment that was specialized but not exotic, and the security features on a 1960s check were, by modern standards, close to non-existent. And then there is the uniform. Institutional deference in that era was considerably stronger than it is now, and a uniform functioned as a credential in itself. A man in an airline captain's uniform was not asked for identification, because the uniform was the identification. The same logic applied to a white coat in a hospital corridor, and a good suit in a courthouse. So the underlying claim, that a confident young man with a uniform and a printing arrangement could move through mid-century America extracting money from institutions that had no practical way to check him, is not fantasy. Versions of it certainly happened. That is what makes this case instructive rather than merely a debunking. The story is not implausible on its face. It is unsupported by the record, which is a different and much subtler problem, and it is the reason the doubts took 40 years to gain any traction. Now let's talk about what happens when people check. The first person to check was not a modern researcher. He was a newspaper reporter, and he did it in 1978, 2 years before the book was even published. Ira Perry, a journalist with the Daily Oklahoman, attended a seminar at which a Bagnall was speaking and became curious about the claims. He began making calls. According to his reporting, he was unable to substantiate the central elements. He reported finding no record supporting the claim of having practiced as a doctor in Georgia in the manner described, no record of admission to the Louisiana bar, and no confirmation of the teaching post. Perry published his findings. Similar skeptical reporting appeared elsewhere in that period. And here is the striking thing: it made no difference. The book came out 2 years later. The story kept growing. The doubts, published in regional newspapers before the internet existed, simply vanished under the weight of the narrative. 4 decades later, a researcher named Alan C. Logan spent several years going back over the same ground with far more archival material available. He published his findings in 2020 in a book titled The Greatest Hoax on Earth, and his work is the most detailed examination of the Abagnale account that exists. The journalist Javier Leiva conducted a parallel investigation for his podcast Pretend, reaching broadly similar conclusions. What Logan reports finding is, in essence, a timeline problem. His central argument is that during the years when Abagnale says he was running a globe-spanning career of impersonation, the documentary record largely places him somewhere else, and frequently in custody. Logan documents an arrest and confinement in a New York youth facility in the mid-60s. He documents periods in county jails. He documents a federal prison sentence. His reconstruction, based on court and correctional records, holds that a substantial portion of the period from roughly 1964 to 1974 was spent incarcerated, which would leave very little room for the 11-month hospital post, the 8 months in the Attorney General's office, the university teaching, and the million miles of flying, all of which would have had to fit in the same window. Logan does not claim Abagnale committed no crimes. This is important, and it is the part most often lost when this story gets retold. The record shows a real check forger who was caught repeatedly, and who served real prison time in more than one country. That much is documented. What Logan disputes is the scale, the sophistication, the exotic impersonations, and the escapes. On the pilot claim specifically, Logan's account is that there was a genuine episode of pilot impersonation, but that it was brief, clumsy, and ended in arrest rather than in a million miles of free travel. On the escape from the taxiing aircraft, and the escape from the Atlanta Federal Detention Center by posing as a prison inspector, Logan reports finding no supporting documentation in the correctional records he obtained, and his account of the actual circumstances differs substantially. And then there is the evidence that is hardest to wave away, because it is not archival. It is human. Logan located and interviewed members of the Parks family of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Their account, as reported, is that in the late 1960s a young woman named Paula Parks, an airline flight attendant, encountered Abagnale, took pity on him, and brought him home. Her family took him in. They gave him a place to stay. They fed him. According to their account, he presented himself falsely to them, stole from them, and passed bad checks, and when it came apart the family were left dealing with the consequences. Their further account, as reported by Logan, is that Abagnale during this Louisiana period was not working in the state attorney general's office. He was working a night shift stocking shelves at a grocery store. The Parks family are named, living people who spoke on the record, and their testimony is specific rather than general. It is the sort of evidence that is difficult to dismiss as a records-keeping gap. So what has Abagnale said? He has not, to my knowledge, published a detailed rebuttal addressing the specific documentary claims. Over the years he has made statements acknowledging that the account contains embellishment, at times attributing this to his co-writer and to publishers who he says dramatize the material, and he has said in interviews that he does not personally vouch for every detail as printed and has never reread the book. He has also, at other times, continued to repeat the central claims publicly. Reporters who approached him after Logan's book was published generally received either no comment or a brief statement declining to engage with the specifics. I want to be careful here. It is entirely possible for a person to have been genuinely victimized by a sensationalizing ghostwriter and a publishing industry that wanted a bigger story. That defense is real, it is not absurd, and it deserves to be stated rather than sneered at. What complicates it is that the amplified version was then repeated, in person, for decades, in paid engagements by the man himself. Now let's get to the part that matters for this series, because the interesting question is not whether the story is true. The interesting question is how a story with published, contemporaneous doubts attached to it since 1978 became one of the most widely believed biographies in the world. The first mechanism is that the claims were, by their nature, close to unfalsifiable. Think about what kind of story it is. The events are crimes, which are committed in secret. The names used were false, which means there is no paper trail under the real name. The victims were institutions that would have been humiliated by admitting they were fooled, which gives them every incentive to stay quiet. And the whole thing happened before centralized digital records existed, in a period when a determined check would have required physically writing to a dozen archives. That is a story built, whether by design or by luck, so that failure to find corroboration proves nothing. Any absence of evidence can be explained by the premise itself. The second mechanism is the most important one, and it recurs across almost every deception we will examine in this series. Institutional laundering. Once the FBI was publicly associated with him, verification effectively stopped. The logic that runs through every audience member's head is straightforward and feels sensible. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is a serious organization staffed by trained investigators. If they have him lecturing at their academy, they must have checked. Nobody gets that close to the FBI without a background check. But that reasoning contains a hidden assumption, and the assumption is wrong. The FBI engaged him as a speaker on fraud prevention. That is not the same as certifying his autobiography. A background check establishes whether someone has a criminal record, and a Bagnell unquestionably did have one, which was precisely the point. It does not establish whether the anecdotes in their memoir are accurate. The endorsement everybody was relying on was never actually an endorsement of the thing they were relying on it for. This pattern is worth burning into memory, because it is how credibility gets manufactured at almost every level. An institution associates with a person for one narrow purpose. The public reads that association as a general certification. Each subsequent institution sees the previous association and reasons that the checking has already been done. Nobody at any point in the chain performs the verification, because everyone assumes someone earlier did. Watch how the chain assembles in this case, because the sequence is the whole trick. A man with a genuine criminal conviction for check fraud offers to speak about check fraud. That is a reasonable proposition, and his conviction is the qualification. An agency books him. A conference organizer sees that the agency booked him and books him too, reasoning that the agency must have vetted him. A publisher sees a man who lectures to federal agents and concludes there is a book in it. A film studio sees a best-selling book that has been in print for 2 decades and concludes there is a film in it. A corporate client sees a man whose life was filmed by Steven Spielberg and concludes he must be exactly who he says he is. At no point in that sequence did anyone do anything unreasonable. Each link behaved sensibly given what was in front of it. And at no point did anyone perform the one action that would have tested the foundation, which was to telephone a hospital in Georgia and ask whether the records showed a Frank Connors supervising interns for 11 months. The chain is strong precisely because each individual link is weak in a way that is invisible from the next link along. This is not unique to a Bagnell. It is the standard architecture of manufactured expertise, and you can see it operating today in wellness, in finance, in technology, and in politics. The credential that convinces you is almost never a certificate. It is a logo, an affiliation, a stage somebody else put them on. The third mechanism was Hollywood. Before 2002, the story was a moderately well-known book with a few skeptical newspaper articles trailing behind it. After Spielberg, DiCaprio, and Hanks, it was canon. A film does something a book cannot. It renders the events as images, and images are stored in memory as if they were witnessed. Millions of people now have a mental picture of a young man in a Pan Am uniform walking through an airport flanked by flight attendants, and that picture feels like evidence even though it is a scene that was designed, lit, and shot in California by people whose job was to make it compelling rather than accurate. Films of this kind also carry a phrase in the opening titles that does an enormous amount of work, based on a true story. That formulation has no legal or factual definition. It is a marketing description. The fourth mechanism is that nobody involved had any incentive to check. Consider each party. The publisher wanted a bestseller, and a heavily verified version would have been a much duller book. The film studio wanted a hit. Conference organizers wanted a speaker who could hold a room, and a Bagnall, by every account including from his critics, was a genuinely superb speaker. Corporate clients wanted a memorable session on fraud awareness. And the FBI got an engaging presenter for training material at low cost. Every single participant benefited from the story being exciting. Not one of them had a job that involved auditing it. That is not a conspiracy. It is simply what happens when verification is nobody's responsibility. And the fifth mechanism is the shape of the story itself, which is perhaps the most human part of this. We want the redemption narrative to be true. A brilliant, wayward boy who does wrong, is caught, pays for it, and then turns his gifts to protecting the people he once preyed on. That is one of the oldest and most satisfying story structures there is. It tells us that talent is not wasted, that people can change, and that institutions are capable of forgiveness. We are strongly disposed to believe it, and a disposition to believe is exactly the vulnerability that every con in this series exploits. That is worth stating plainly as a principle. The stories most likely to fool you are the ones you would like to be true. So does it matter? There is a case for saying no, and it deserves a hearing. A Bagnall's fraud prevention advice has been described by many people in the field as sound and practical, and he was reportedly involved in advising on check security design. If his lectures made banks and companies more careful, and if his advice prevented real losses, then some argue the biography was a delivery mechanism for genuinely useful content, and the delivery mechanism does not have to be true. I do not find that persuasive, for two reasons. The first is that the entire commercial value of the lectures rested on the biography. Nobody was paying premium fees for generic fraud awareness slides. They were paying to hear the man who did it. The story was not incidental packaging around the product. The story was the product. The second reason is the Parks family. Whatever one concludes about airplanes and hospitals, there are named people in Baton Rouge who say they opened their home to a young man and were robbed for it, and who then watched that same period of their lives get retold to the world as a glamorous caper in which they did not appear. That is not a victimless discrepancy. That is somebody's actual life being written over. Which brings us to the thing that makes this story genuinely unsettling rather than merely amusing. For roughly 40 years, an audience of corporate executives and federal agents sat in rooms and were taught how to detect deception. They were taught to verify credentials, to be suspicious of a confident manner, to check documents rather than trusting the person presenting them, to understand that the most effective imposter is the one who looks exactly like the role. They were taught all of this by a man whose own credentials, according to a substantial body of investigative work, nobody in the room had checked. If the research is right, then the lecture was, in a strange way, entirely honest. It was a live demonstration of its own subject matter, running continuously for 4 decades, and the audience never once noticed that the demonstration was happening to them. That is the lesson to carry out of this episode. The most powerful credential in the world is not a certificate. It is another institution's endorsement. And institutions endorse people for narrow, specific, mundane reasons, then watch that endorsement get read by everyone else as a general guarantee they never intended to give and never verified. When you next find yourself trusting someone because of who they are associated with, the useful question is not whether the association is real. It usually is. The useful question is, what, exactly, did that institution actually check? And would they have had any reason to check the specific thing I am now relying on? There is a practical version of this that costs almost nothing. Claims about credentials are, in the modern world, verifiable in a way they simply were not in 1969. Medical licenses, bar admissions, pilot certifications, academic appointments, and professional registrations are held in public registers, and most of them can be searched online in under a minute by anyone. Regulators maintain public lists of individuals barred from the financial industry. Court records in most jurisdictions are accessible. The reason people do not check is not difficulty. It is social awkwardness. Verifying somebody's claim about themselves feels like an accusation, and the more impressive the person and the more enthusiastic the room, the more it feels like a breach of manners. The con does not survive because verification is hard. It survives because verification is rude. So the useful habit is a quiet one. You do not need to challenge anyone. You do not need to announce that you are checking. You look it up afterwards, privately, and the entire cost is 2 minutes and a small amount of curiosity. And it is worth noticing where the resistance comes from when you feel it. If the thought of checking a person's claims makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is usually telling you something about how much you want the story to be true, and that is exactly the moment when checking is most worth doing. Frank Abagnale was a real criminal. That is documented. He forged checks, he was caught, and he went to prison for it in more than one country. Nobody disputes that. Whether he was also a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and a professor before his 22nd birthday is a question that the available records, according to the people who have gone looking through them most carefully, do not support. And the film will keep playing regardless, because a good story, once it is loose in the world, is very nearly impossible to catch. Next time on The Great Cons, we turn to a woman who convinced the wealthiest people in Manhattan that she was a German heiress with a fortune held up in Europe, using almost no money, a great deal of confidence, and the near total unwillingness of rich people to admit they do not recognize someone. Thank you for watching. If this was worth your time, please give it a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment below telling us which con, fraud, or forgery we should take apart next.